Hello and welcome back to my channel. Bonsoir et bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel and in this video I will be doing my March and beginning of April reading wrap-up. As you will have undoubtedly noticed, I am very late with this wrap-up and there is a specific reason as to why this is the case. I will go into at the end of the video. That way if you're not interested you can easily skip it. But so otherwise I'm going to talk about the 4 books I read in March and the 3 books I read in the first 10 days of April, and we'll start with the non-fiction. So this past month, or rather these past 5 weeks, I read 2 books of non-fiction. The first I'm going to talk about is Bonk, The Curious Coupling of Sex and Science, written by Mary Roach. Mary Roach is known to write about different types of subjects in a purportedly funny way. I'll come back to the humor in a minute. So Bonk is a non-fiction book that gives an overview of the research, past and present, that has been and is being conducted into human sexual physiology and human sexual behavior. The focus of this book is thus principally on studies done about the physiological responses and biomechanics involved in sexual intercourse, and those done about the influence and impact of psychology or emotions, broadly speaking, on sexual response and behavior. There basically isn't anything about the wider sociological or anthropological aspects of human sexuality here, but that has been written in other books, obviously. And as an overview, or even pop science reference book, if you will, I found it pretty comprehensive. You'll learn here lots of things about orgasms, both male and female sexual anatomy and sexual response. Indeed, the book is pretty egalitarian in that regard, which was a plus. The physiological mechanics of intercourse, the confusing role of hormones in both male and female libido, the latter specifically, the weird pieces of tech that have been devised and used to study all of this, the works of the likes of Kinsey, Masters and Johnson's, but also earlier pioneers of sex research and contemporary ones. So overall, I really enjoyed this book, but I do have a couple of pieces of criticism. First, this book, like I said, is marketed as being quite funny. All of Mary Roach's writing is put forward as being quite funny. She's presented as a funny non-fiction writer, but I mean, her humor didn't really particularly land for me at all, so that didn't add anything for me to this book, but this is really a matter of personal taste and preference, so perhaps it'll work for you. And then this book also could be seen as being a little dated given its 2008 or 2009 publication date. Now, sure, it's not that old either, but since research moves ever forward, I'd imagine we've learned a lot more about human sexuality since then, and an updated version of this book could be worthwhile. More specifically though, I find it really strange that the very probable role of the submerged part of the clitoris in so-called vaginal orgasms was never really mentioned. The full structure of the clitoris was mentioned, but the author and researchers she interviewed kept wondering why some women do experience pleasure and orgasms from vaginal penetration and or stimulation, and I was like, really? You're not going to mention the internal clitoris as the obvious candidate here? And I mean, I have come across articles mentioning precisely that, so I was a bit confused as to why it wasn't at all mentioned in this book, and everyone just kept being confused about why it is that some women do enjoy penetration, and I was like, okay, whatever. So that was the most glaring example, but there were a couple of other instances where I felt information was missing, perhaps because it came to light after the publication date of this book. Despite that, however, I would definitely recommend this book to those of you who, like me, have a particular and or special interest in human sexuality and human sexual physiology, and I gave it a solid 7.5 out of 10, so I'm glad I read this. Then I also read this, Lady Sapiens, or Lady Sapiens. This is a French language non-fiction book that reviews the current knowledge we have about prehistoric women, what they probably looked like, what they did among their social groups, and what social status they might have held as well. As a corollary to this, the book also briefly addresses the question of prehistoric matriarchy, or rather matrilineal / matrifocal societies, and goddess worship. It was written by 2 movie directors as a companion publication to the documentary they made of the same name, which I haven't seen, under the scientific supervision of a prehistoric researcher who wrote and published a study through Oxford University Press, I believe, and in collaboration with various researchers from the fields of paleoarchaeology, paleoanthropology, ethnology, paleobiology, you know, for things like DNA analysis, etc. Now, at times I found that the tone and biased interpretations of the directors came through a little too strongly for my taste or comfort, though those biases were never really ideological in nature, just more personal. I mean, that's how I felt about it. A strong note of caution is given at the beginning of the book about drawing parallels between contemporary hunter-gatherer societies and prehistoric ones, yet they are both referenced often and inconsistently. The same went to a lesser degree with the mentioning of great apes or even other humans such as Neanderthals, and I was confused at times by this. It felt as if parallels were drawn and shortcuts made by the non-scientist authors to conveniently put forward one theory over another, when the relevance of ethnographic or anthropological data was presented as a lot more ambiguous, or I mean as being a lot more ambiguous or nuanced by the actual scientists they consulted with. Yeah, it was just a bit confusing. And this was especially salient and egregious too in the chapter about prehistoric sexuality. Marriage and monogamy were presented as givens without even a pretense of trying to define what those might have looked like exactly to pre-agricultural and broadly speaking, patriarchal / androcratic societies. The variety of psychosexual systems in contemporary hunter-gatherer or hybrid agricultural societies was here conveniently ignored mostly, and the chapter essentially focused on procreation, despite the fact year-round non-reproductive sex is a hallmark of our species, though a nod was given to the probability that prehistoric women used abortifacient plants and had control over their reproductive functions to a certain extent. So I'll give them that. But so yes, the defining feature of our species is our hypersexuality in a way, and this was mentioned in the opening of that chapter about prehistoric sexuality, but then it was laid by the wayside. A rock carving of two women who might have been engaging in some sort of lesbian sex was briefly presented, but then there was no real discussion about what homosexual behavior might have looked like in prehistoric times, how it might have been tolerated or integrated differently among early hunter-gatherers, given the greater fluidity of gendered roles and the relative egalitarianism a lot of researchers think was common back then. Or even broadly speaking, the matrifocality some researchers think was common back then, which conversely would have precluded variability, social variability among hunter-gatherer groups of prehistory either. Despite my criticisms, however, I still think this book worked as a decent starting point for the subject, or even a layman's reference book, and it clearly does take advantage of the fact the fields of prehistoric research have become open to women in a way they never were before, and this of course has allowed for new viewpoints to emerge, for new perspectives to decipher data from prehistoric digs, etc. So that's a net positive. And in the end, I gave this book a solid 7 out of 10 and would thus recommend it to those who read French, of course, though obviously I hope that similar books will come out in the future that will be even more thorough with the presentation of its data and go into ever wider areas of speculation, though still firmly grounded in physical data. So, besides the nonfiction, I read 5 novels these past 5 weeks, 2 of them in ebook format. The first I read at the very beginning of March was The End of Men by Christina Sweeney-Baird. I think it's her first novel. So, The End of Men is an apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic story about a virus that only kills men and kills them very efficiently to a point where 90% of the human male population dies off. So yes, it is a pandemic story, so if you're not too keen on those at the moment or ever, then stay clear from this one, obviously. It is told through several points of view, most of them female, and progresses chronologically through all the what I'll call classical stages of pandemic over several years, from its initial outbreak in Scotland, Glasgow more specifically, to a state of relative stability. I don't really consider this a spoiler. The writing was fine, to the point, it did the job of telling the story in a straightforward fashion. Overall, it was a fast-paced story with lots of relatively short point-of-view chapters, interspersed here and there with fake newspaper articles, blog posts, and forum posts from conspiracy theorists. A lot like the structure you have in The Power by Naomi Alderman, with which this novel shares a similar tone overall, actually, which wasn't a positive in my book. So like I said, there are multiple points of view, a few of them recurring. Among those, you have a doctor who is the first person to report the outbreak and is promptly ignored by public health authorities. An extremely unrealistic scenario, I might add, that I'll touch upon again in a few seconds. There's an anthropologist suffering from infertility who loses her husband and her first male child, a black single mother who works as a senior analyst at either MI5 or MI6, a virologist microbiologist, something of that general order, who comes to England from America to try and crack the genetic code of the virus, and a lesbian immunologist who tries to find a vaccine for the virus. But of course, there are other punctual points of view you get, but those are like the main recurring ones. So yes, there was a bit of diversity among the points of view characters. Not quite as much, though, as one could potentially expect from such a story, and all firmly from the global north. And the story really takes place in the global north. I mean, there's kind of a subplot with China, where the women of China go through a civil war, and the country basically breaks up into several city-states. But otherwise, you don't really learn what happens in Africa, the Middle East, South America, and that was, to my mind, a really big missed opportunity. Even The Power actually did better in that respect. Then, I mean, you could also point out that most of the women were of the same age, and most of them focused on the men in their lives, so not terribly great on the Bechdel scale, despite the premise of the book. Though, on a purely personal basis, I didn't really mind, and I thought that it made sense for these female characters to mourn and think about their lost husbands, their lost sons. So, I mean, it didn't bother me as much as it did other readers I came across on Goodreads. However, the story does focus a lot on maternity, having children, or infertility, fertility, all of that, and that's something I never relate to, so I just didn't care about that, and there was quite a bit of that in this novel. Theme-wise, it was just really disappointing, because it was just surprisingly light thematically. The story mostly centered on the grief of the characters, which, I mean, fair enough, and on regrets linked to maternity, infertility, losing one's status as a mother, desiring children but not knowing how to have them in a world where 1 out of every 10 people now is a man. So okay, but when it came to the impact of sex and gender on a society devoid of most of its male members, there really wasn't much discussed at all. All I can really point to are a couple of, fair enough, astute and kind of amusing remarks made by the intelligence analyst about the fact that most emergency services were staffed by men, and so their dying en masse had caused absolute chaos with regards to managing emergencies, you know, firefighters, police officers, security agents, and that's a good point. But then on the more amusing front, she also remarked that conversely, the intelligence service didn't really have to worry about terrorism anymore because most terrorists had been men, which is completely true. It's not something you would necessarily think about in this scenario, but it is absolutely correct, so I kind of chuckled at that. But still, beyond that and beyond, a bit dropped about the fluidity or the supposed fluidity of female sexuality and female dating towards the end of the book, and a scene pointing out how gay men had become a super minority. There just wasn't much there. Honestly, I'd argue that, you know, the graphic novel series Why the Last Man is just as deep thematically as this novel was, which was surprising and disappointing, definitely. And when it comes to its science fictional world building, that was probably its most flawed aspect. Now, there is first, one thing I didn't really notice myself at first, but a lot of other readers pointed this out on Goodreads, that the depictions of A&E services were abysmally inaccurate. But then what first jumped out at me as being absolutely ridiculous and unbelievable, and which I maintain is the most ridiculous aspect of the very premise of this novel, is the fact that So there's this female doctor in Glasgow who first notices this novel virus killing men very efficiently, very quickly. She contacts the public health authorities and she's promptly ignored, and it takes weeks, if not a couple of months, for people to actually realize, oh, there's a virus killing men and we should probably worry about this. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but we live in a largely still androcentric world, in a world where there are thousands of research papers about erectile dysfunction and a fifth of that number devoted to female sexual pain and female-specific medical conditions. Am I really supposed to believe that were there to be a virus that kills men, kills them very efficiently, kills them very quickly, no one would care? I'm sorry, I don't believe that for a second. Authorities, health authorities, research authorities would be on that shit immediately. There'd be general panic. They'd pour all the bloody money into research to battle the virus, find a vaccine, etc. Honestly, generally, I would say that we'd have a quicker response to any kind of novel virus that is very aggressive, but especially a virus that targets men, come on. So that was just a ginormous gaping hole in the base premise that I had to purposefully ignore and put to the side, otherwise I couldn't have even read through the novel at all. But then there's also the fact that the scientific world more generally reacts very slowly. That wasn't realistic. There's the fact that scientists, researchers don't seem to talk to one another in this story. That isn't realistic at all either, given the communication that does happen in the scientific community. And then even with regards to the biology of the virus itself, there were issues. The author does give a basic explanation for how the virus targets only men. It's linked to the sex chromosomes. Okay, you do have medical conditions that work that way. But the mechanism she gives, the allelic probabilities involved, I mean, it's stuff I studied a little bit at university, so I wasn't super fresh on it, but still, the numbers given on the page, the numbers given of the amount of men who die, it just didn't add up. I would have assumed that if that many men had actually died, would actually die in this scenario, civilization would collapse a lot more strongly than it actually does in the book. I don't know, just stuff didn't add up numerically. It didn't work. The science was really bad. I mean, the science fiction was really bad in this novel, basically. Ultimately, The End of Men gave me mixed vibes, combining The Power by Naomi Alderman. This is not a positive because I really didn't like that novel at all. And Why the Last Man, which was better because I did enjoy Why the Last Man, but I enjoyed it more than I enjoyed The End of Men. Still, I rated this novel out of 5 out of 10 and not lower because I did find it mildly entertaining while I read through it, because I could relate to the grief felt by some of the characters at losing their male partners, so it moved me in that regard. But yeah, I mean, there are much better pandemic thrillers out there, like the movie Contagion, which I maintain is probably one of the best that exist. But I mean, if you want an easy, quick, and popcorn type read, I guess you could go for this novel, but beyond that, I really wouldn't particularly recommend it at all. Then I also read The Day of the Triffids, written by John Wyndham and first published in the 1950s, I believe. And it is another apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic story, but here its originality lies in that it features 2 causes that lead to the downfall of humanity. One of them are the titular Triffids, mutated carnivorous plants that can move around and develop a particular taste for human flesh, especially after humans have all gone blind from a meteorite, the other cause of the apocalypse. The story centers on one main male character, a biologist who specialized in Triffids before the world went to shit, named Bill Mason, who escaped blindness and, well, tries to survive the aftermath of everything, basically. Now, I realize I made a mistake, actually. I didn't read 2 ebooks. I read one ebook, The End of Man, and I listened to The Day of the Triffids on audiobook. But despite that, I could tell that it was actually a really well-written novel with a very good level of English. It was medium to fast-paced, though to be fair, I do listen to audiobooks on 1.25 to 1.75 speed, so make of that what you will. But the book only features Bill Mason's point of view, and there are a lot of introspective moments and passages, but I didn't feel it ever bogged the story down, so that was definitely not a negative. The character work generally was fine. I felt it mostly served to explore questions of morality in the face of societal, civilizational collapse, though clearly the main characters were definitely more good than bad in a traditional sense, I suppose. It's not a grim, dark story by any means, though it is grim because it's an apocalyptic tale. But the main characters are basically decent people. There was a central romance that served to move the plot forward, and I really didn't care for it at all, precisely because it was a convenient plot device, and because, well, linked to that, it was kind of insta-lovey more than anything else. There was also a secondary character that served to theme dump a bit, is what I'm going to call it, but I didn't really mind too much, though it did remind me of the fairly condensed way the theming was delivered or layered into the story of The Chrysalids, my first John Wyndham novel, which I read last year or the year before, I can't remember now. World building wise, I liked the fact that the end of the world had two distinct causes that made it a bit different, but it also made the structure and pacing feel a little wonky at times. I can't really define it more precisely than that, unfortunately. Sorry, you'll just have to take my word at face value, but that's how I felt. And especially because the Triffids themselves felt secondary to a lot of the story, weirdly enough. They were kind of like in the background for the first third to the first half of the book when they are part of the title, so I don't know. It's something other readers have remarked upon on Goodreads. It didn't quite bug me as such, but it was a little strange. That being said, those Triffids were pretty neat, cool in concept, and sufficiently creepy to justify their presence in the story, if that makes sense. And I'll also add, there is a minor plot twist at the end that rewards the attentive reader, and I spotted it and felt rewarded for spotting it, but so yes, there is a bit of a plot twist, but of course I'm not going to spoil it. Now, even though the thematic delivery wasn't as subtle or spread out as it should have ideally been, I appreciated what the story had to say or encouraged to think about the cycles of time, civilization, and civilizational collapse, about the hubris, that eternal hubris of humankind and the way it plays with fire when it comes to dangerous technologies, and about the ultimate frailty of our species. Though I think there is the hopeful message as well that this frailty can be offset by accumulating and transmitting knowledge if we are careful and conscientious enough about it. So overall, I think I preferred The Day of the Triffids to The Chrysalids and gave it a 6.5 out of 10. I guess I must have given a 6 out of 10 to The Chrysalids. I don't know yet if I'll go on to check other John Wyndham novels, but this one was enjoyable and entertaining enough and provided a small but pleasant bonus of intellectual stimulation, though I definitely don't have any interest in watching an old horror movie adaptation of it. At first, I didn't realize it was actually based on a novel. And so over the latter half of the month of March and the beginning of the month of April, I reread the Southern Reach trilogy written by Jeff VanderMeer, comprised of Volume 1 Annihilation, Volume 2 Authority, and Volume 3 Acceptance. I will try and make a series review for this trilogy because that's what I had originally planned and that's what I think it deserves, but I can't guarantee it'll come out very soon. So I will share some of my thoughts about my rereading experience here. When it comes to Annihilation, I gave this a 9.5 out of 10. I definitely enjoyed this more the second time around. I enjoyed the trilogy more the second time around. I mean, it's definitely still one of my favorite SFF series or works of SFF literature period of all time. I mentioned it in my top 10 favorite works of science fiction video. It had become an all-time favorite in 2017 when I first read it, and it just still is, and I definitely think I appreciate it even more now that I've reread it. So when it comes to Annihilation in particular, I gave it a 9.5 out of 10. I realized that it actually really works as a standalone, so if you've been curious about the Southern Reach trilogy or you've heard about Annihilation specifically, perhaps because of the god-awful movie adaptation they made of it, just read it. And if you're happy with the way it ends and you've heard that the second and third books aren't as good, you can just be satisfied with reading this one as a standalone, because it really does work as a standalone. It's a near flawless or near perfect book, in my opinion, with its delivery of emotional punches, the what the fucky aspect of being in Area X, the central place and character, I want to say, of this trilogy, with the cosmic and body horror elements, the subtle theming regarding grief, surrender, identity, loneliness, alienation, and of course these themes permeate the entire trilogy, but you definitely get a good dose of them just in book one. I also appreciated the main character of the biologist a lot more this time around, and I could relate to her more. I personally think you can kind of read her as on the spectrum. She wasn't specifically written that way, I don't believe, but I think you can read her that way if you feel so inclined. So yes, I mean, should I give a synopsis of the Southern Reach in brief? There's a very strange place in the southern United States with pristine wilderness that has a strange border. You can only enter it through one specific place, and weird things happen within this Area X. Transformations, biological weirdness, monsterish type things, etc., etc. And the series' titular Southern Reach is the intelligence agency set up to try and understand what the fuck is happening with this Area X. So yes, this was just near perfect. Just absolutely brilliant piece of literature, not even that long either. Then with Authority, I think a lot of people, understandably, find this a weaker book, don't like it as much as Annihilation. I've read less specific things about Acceptance, but definitely for Authority. Authority is a very different kind of novel. It works more as a spy thriller, though it still gravitates, orbits the central mystery of Area X and what happened in the first novel and what happened within the history of this Area X, which you get snippets of in the first novel. There is a different main character, and there are more characters because this takes place at this intelligence agency of the Southern Reach, trying to study, crack, understand Area X. So it's a different kind of novel. The themes are still related to what you find in Annihilation, but are subtly different as well. Control as a character is the main male character, becomes director of the Southern Reach, and is an intelligence agent. I mean, they refer to this as central, but it's basically the CIA, right? I mean, it's never mentioned as such, but I'm pretty certain that's what you're supposed to understand it as. So that main character is very different to the main character of Annihilation, the biologist. But I still found him interesting. I found his struggles interesting, especially as they interweave themselves with the struggles of the Southern Reach to try and understand Area X. So yes, it's definitely the weakest entry of the trilogy, but I still enjoyed it for what it was, and for the simple fact that it progressed the mystery and story of Area X and its weirdness. And then finally you have Acceptance, and honestly, so Authority, I gave it an 8 to an 8.5 out of 10. Acceptance, again, this time around, I really appreciated how near perfect of a conclusion it is to the Southern Reach trilogy. It just takes all these narrative and thematic and emotional strands from the two previous books, adds in some of its own, and then wraps them all up in a very viscerally satisfying way. I found you don't get answers to all of your questions because that's kind of the point. There's a strong element of cosmic horror and cosmic unknowableness at the heart of this story, at the heart of its world building and even theming in a way that humans cannot understand everything. So that to me was perfect, but still things overall felt wrapped up to me in a satisfying way. There were strong emotional punches, a lot of backstory given to some of the main players of this tale, and you do get answers to some of your questions regarding Area X. Again, I didn't quite realize this the first time around, but you do get some answers, and the rest is up to your own speculative spirit, I suppose. But yes, just a brilliant conclusion overall, I really think. So this I gave a 9 out of 10, and the trilogy as a whole is basically a 9.5 out of 10. Just shy of that 10, but there's a reason why it became an all-time favorite in 2017, and there's a very good reason why it still remains an all-time science fiction favorite. More specifically, weird science fiction in this case, but still broadly science fiction, and I would very much definitely recommend you pick this one up. If there's only one thing you should read from Jeff VanderMeer, read this trilogy, honestly, or even just read Annihilation. But yes, though I would also recommend other novels by Jeff VanderMeer. He's one of my favorite authors, so, you know, that's that. And hopefully I can go into more depth in a dedicated series review sometime in the future. So before I get into my personal life update / explanation, I'm also going to mention the fact that I have been playing Elden Ring. Sadly, I haven't been able to appreciate it as much as I definitely should because of those personal life reasons, but still, it's, yes, a bloody amazing game. I do love it though. As much as I'm able to feel things at the moment, I do really love that game. It does mix in the best aspects of something like Zelda Breath of the Wild and a From Software game. For me, in any case, I love the open world, the exploration, the versatility of weapons handling, of character builds. The lore, though it's still a bit nebulous to me, but I'm enjoying trying to crack it. I'm definitely noticing these George R.R. Martinian elements mixing in with the Miyazakian elements. Is just a brilliant blend. Maybe I'll do a dedicated video to Elden Ring. Why not? That could be fun. I also didn't really say anything about the teaser that was dropped for the Tolkien show. I'll definitely talk about it some more in the future, but for now, suffice it to say that I have extremely low expectations for it. I'm expecting an absolute shit show, in all honesty. And finally, with regards to an rest of April TBR, I just don't really want to give a TBR at the minute because my mental health is not stable enough for me to do so, quite simply. I am reading things, and I will have things hopefully to talk about at the end of April, beginning of May, but so I'm not going to give a definite TBR at this time, but hopefully I can do that again in the future. So for those of you who want to leave off here, I hope you have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Do take good care of yourselves as much as you're able to, and I shall see you all sometime in another video. Bye-bye. So now I'm going to go into personal life stuff that probably is going to be slightly TMI, but I'm kind of beyond caring at this point. So here goes. Back in October 2021, I was contacted by the man who became my best friend and partner through Booktube and Goodreads, and we entered into a deep, intense, loving, and quite frankly, soulmate tier relationship. Everything we felt for one another was reciprocated, as I'd never known before. Everything felt natural and easy, as I'd never known before. And all of those feelings were confirmed when I spent 2 weeks with him in person in Stirling back in January. Everything was so warm and wonderful between us, and we had several plans for the future. In fact, thanks to him, I could actually project myself in the future in a positive way. This has since gone. In March, my partner was supposed to spend 2 weeks with me here in Brussels, was going to meet my parents, had even bought them a nice bottle of whiskey. Then 2 weeks before, we had a silly argument one evening, or rather a heated intellectual conversation like we'd had several times before, and he abruptly hung up on me, clearly upset. And I was worried about this, but I mean, I knew he'd had his own struggles with mental health, which he definitely minimized looking back on it. He seemed anxious and depressed to me and was tapering off of his antidepressant venlafaxine too quickly, and I told him as much, but he brushed my concerns aside, so I let them go. He'd also had what I'll call an autistic shutdown of sorts the week before, but it had been resolved. He'd apologized, and everything seemed perfectly fine between us. So 24 hours after our argument, I received a message from him that was completely unhinged and featured religious allegorical imagery when he's an atheist. A spiritual atheist, sure, but still an atheist, definitely not a Christian, and yet he rambled on about Lilith, Adam, Eve, called me his true soulmate, and a demon in the same bloody sentence. 48 hours later, he announced our relationship was over and made paranoid threats about calling the police if I ever showed up in Stirling. I received another couple of emails after that, also filled with paranoid and religious delusions. I mean, what I can only surmise are delusions. because otherwise it doesn't make any bloody sense. Beyond that, really, his personality just flipped 180 degrees in the span of a couple of days, and my partner went from being the most loving, sweet, understanding and supportive person to being a horribly cold, callous, condescending and hypocritical person, completely indifferent to my feelings and my pain. Though obviously if he is psychotically depressed, as I believe, as my therapist believes, as a few of the people aware of my situation believe, then he probably can't feel much of anything at all. So that's what happened 5 weeks ago. I was rejected by my severely mentally ill soulmate, whom I cannot help because we live in different countries, and whom I can only worry about because he has no friends whatsoever and is estranged from his family. Yes, there might have been some minor red flags I missed, but overall I have to believe the relationship and love I had with my partner was real, because I'm in enough excruciating pain and despair as it is. And yes, I realize I should probably call him my ex-partner, but I just can't accept or legitimize a breakup that was done by a person very much off his head with clearly compromised cognitive faculties because of what I can't but understand as psychosis. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense otherwise. So all this has driven my own mental health into a deep pit of hellfire. Yes, I'm being hyperbolic, sue me, I guess, but that's just how I feel. I am extremely depressed, even if it doesn't appear so. I am exhausted, partly because of all this and partly because of the medication I'm being given, and I barely do anything most days, and I'm just trying but mostly failing to cope with the situation. I've basically lost all hope and motivation. I feel extremely lonely and worthless. What happened with my partner hurts not only because I've lost my soulmate to mental illness, lost him to this mean, cruel person who just said the most horrible things to me, but also because the violence of it has triggered all the pain from the unresolved trauma and mental health issues I had before meeting my partner. But that's just the way it is. Life just sucks sometimes. Sometimes those you love the most destroy you, even if they didn't originally mean to, and leave you irrevocably broken and tainted. At least I have the small blessing of being able to read again, because I couldn't for 3 weeks. That's why I read so little in March. And yes, so I can escape into reading and video games to a much lesser extent on some days, not even every day. I do want to keep up my presence on Booktube, even though it feels a little cursed, given I met my partner through it. I want to keep up my presence on Goodreads and Instagram, basically my presence in my book sphere is what I'm going to call it. I do want to do book reviews again. I want to do a series review for The Southern Reach, but it's going to be very hard because I am absolutely exhausted all the time. I basically want to keep making content, like I said, on my book sphere, but yes, it might be less regular than it was for a while, and I do apologize in advance for that. So there you have it. Thank you to those of you who stuck around to listen to this. I know it's not interesting or entertaining in the slightest, but I felt the need to be transparent. So on that very final note, I do wish you all a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Do take good care of yourselves, and I shall strive to see you all at some point in the future in another video. Bye bye.